So the Ibis Ripmo comparison and review. Today we're going to go over both the Ripmo AF and the Ripmo V2 Carbon. I haven't done that in a while. It's a little bit slippery. This video is made possible thanks to support from Jensen USA. Jensen's a leading online retailer for mountain bikes, parts and accessories here in the United States of America, and they've got a great selection of bikes from Ibis, including these two Ripmos. I've got a link in the description below over to Jensen's website, and anything you purchase from that link will directly help support my channel. It's a big part of how we make these videos keep coming for all of you. I'm also supported by Industry 9 and P&W Components, which are also both available at Jensen USA. I do want to disclose one thing. I used to work at Ibis from 2008 to 2015, and then I carried on as a bit of a sponsored rider for a few years after that. I did not buy either of these bikes. They were both sent to me for initial product release, product launch videos, and as a result, both of them are honestly pre-production samples. I know the Ripmo AF has a bunch of differences between what's actually production available, and the Ripmo Carbon V2 might have some differences. I haven't figured those out quite yet for myself. Regardless, I think the ride impressions are going to be 95% accurate with these sample bikes, especially after 4 seasons riding both these things. Let's jump into it. So I first got the Ripmo AF back in August of 2019. Pre-production sample bike. I had just broken my pelvis and could barely ride, and one of my first rides back we filmed, and that was the launch video for the Ripmo AF. The Carbon V2 I got back in January of 2020 before everything turned upside down. So just a quick little 10,000 foot overview. Both these bikes are nearly the same. They use 29-inch wheels front and rear. They have a 160 travel fork, 147, so basically 150 mils of travel in back. They're both considered modern enduro bikes, so they have pretty slack head tube angles, pretty long wheelbases, but they still climb pretty darn well. This means that with that geometry and that amount of travel, they can go downhill pretty quick. Who are these bikes for? Well, they're for basically everyone. They're for the rider that really wants to enjoy the descent and not have any excuses on tap for not doing big jumps, steep drops, any of that. They're very competent descenders, but they're able to climb faster than inflation with its pretty good modern geometry. But there's one little hiccup there that I'll talk about in a moment. People ask me if these are enough bike for gnarly places. Generally, yes. Is it too much bike for less gnarly places? Depends. Depends on what your skill level is and what you want to experience. I really like these bikes for all-around bikes, and I've had a lot of personal friends that aren't involved in this little bike world ask me what mountain bike should I get to ride our local trails here in the Northwest, and I almost always tell them the Ripmo AF. They're on sale right now, like 25% off, so it's a smoking deal. And that bike is such a good bike for so many people. If you're not super competent, it'll take care of a lot of, let's say, challenges on the trail. It'll make it easier to get through the rough stuff. If you are competent, you're gonna have plenty of bike that'll just take whatever you're dishing out at it. So that said, I'm a big fan of both these bikes. I really like them. I do prefer the Carbon one, and we'll go over that in just a minute here. Now, that quick little hiccup I wanted to mention. So these bikes are supposed to be the same, and they are for size small, large, and extra large, but size medium has an important difference. The size medium Ripmo Carbon V2 has a 77-degree seat tube angle, whereas the aluminum one has a 76. That slightly steeper seat tube angle in turn ends up with a touch longer wheelbase, probably. There's also a caveat there in that Ibis reports the geometry of the same bike with different forks on it. So they use a 5mm longer fork in the geometry chart for the Ripmo AF than they do for the Carbon one. I think that's because the fork they spec on the complete bikes is a little different for the AF versus the Carbon. I live in a frame-only world, not in a complete bike world, so yeah. I've ridden both these bikes with the same wheels, forks, drivetrains, components, the whole kit and caboodle, identical, so I've been able to isolate down the differences. In terms of geometry, I don't notice a ton on the trail. Is 3mm a wheelbase and 1 degree a seat tube angle a make or break scenario? No, it's not. Most people will never be able to tell that difference. I've ridden mountain bikes professionally for a long time, and before that for 25+ years, and I can barely tell a difference in geometry. Overall, the geometry of these bikes is really good. It covers such a wide range of the spectrum that, I wouldn't really tweak much. There's a few little things I would adjust if I had my druthers, but yeah, we'll get to that. While we're still talking about geometry, one of my favorite things about these bikes, the amount of seat tube insertion depth is very healthy. So I can run a full 200 millimeters of drop on both of these bikes. And if you have it wheels in the air riding style, if you're very aggressive and get low on the bike, that extra seat post drop is just such a home run. So that's one of my favorite things about both of these bikes. Back end's on the shorter side, about 435 or so if I remember correctly. I don't think it's too short. It feels pretty balanced. The reach measurement being about 460, a few mils shorter for one of them than the other. That's a pretty healthy reach. I'm 5'8", 174 centimeters. And at 5'8", I'm riding a size medium, and I really like the size medium for all of these Ibis bikes in this day and age. If you're a racer, you could go size large to get a little bit bigger wheelbase and be faster. But if you're not trying to race, medium at 5'8" is spot on. A few nitty-gritty details of how these bikes differ. So I've got the same water bottle cage on both bikes, the Arundel carbon cage, and I can't fit a full-size bottle on the aluminum one, whereas I can on the carbon. Small little difference.
Ran out of core strength.
While we're on the topic of geometry, I want to mention the bottom bracket height's not super high. And so with the Orbea Occam and the Pivot Switchblade, I didn't have my pedals catch as much stuff as I do have on these bikes. I've got a pile of bent pedals and broken pedals that can attest to how low the bottom bracket is here. I've actually really liked 2.6 size tires to help raise these bikes up a little bit. That bottom bracket height thing isn't a huge deal for most people in most places, but if you live someplace chunky like Arizona or with a lot of rocks, you know, it can be nice to have a little bit more clearance. I tend to catch pedals more on descents where I'm landing in weird spots. Usually my back right foot is the one that ends up catching stuff with that pedal because that's my lower pedal when I'm getting kind of rowdy there. Smoother trails, bike park flow trails, bottom bracket height's not a concern at all. It's just people like me riding weird trails, doing weird things might notice that. Let's get to the part that all you guys love talking about, and that's suspension. Both the bikes have, in theory, the same rear suspension, and it's generally pretty darn good. It's a DW Link design, and that's built to pedal very efficiently with good traction when you're seated and pedaling. Some bikes do have more anti-squat, which means you probably end up with a touch less traction when you're seated and pedaling. Some bikes have less, so it'd be a little bit more open and back. I think this is a great compromise. That said, I don't really care that much how my bikes pedal, as long as it's good enough. Both of these are far better than just good enough. I've noticed more how easily a bike bottoms out. With the stock DVO Topaz shock, I really like that shock. It's great, but I have to use the maximum number of volume reducers to prevent myself from bottoming out on big out of control landings and even on the tighter, more boostier takeoffs. I need to increase the progression.
Oh God. Oh. I regret that pedal stroke more than anything in my entire life.
I've really grown to love the little Fox DPX2 rear shock, and I think the newer Fox Float X would also feel good. I have a Float X2, and it works fine on here, but I prefer the smaller shock, and I prefer the DVO over that bigger Float X2. The Float X2 is fine, but it just has so much oil in it, and an older style of damping. It doesn't feel as free and open as either of those two options. And I think the Öhlins shock might be a really good fit for these bikes. Frame adjustability is like this latest hot topic, and neither of these Ripmos are adjustable in any way, and I think that's totally fine. Ibis has a great starting point, and yes, you can still adjust them with like an angle set. Works Components makes a really good angle adjusting headset. I don't actually feel like I desperately need an angle adjusting headset on these bikes. I have adjusted them a little bit with using 2.6 tires on occasion. I prefer the carbon one with a 170 fork. The aluminum one I prefer with a 160. And this also comes back to something I mentioned in the past that has a lot of people really confused. So I'm a former pro level racer, and I tend to push bikes relatively hard. And I've also got a pre-production Ripmo AF here, and I notice the front end gets pretty flexy. If I'm standing up and sprinting, you can kind of notice it, but if I'm landing a big jump, that's when I really start to notice the actual ride characteristic being different between these two bikes. I don't know if it's just my pre-production Ripmo AF front triangle, which is different than the current one, or if it's actually the aluminum bike isn't as stiff as the carbon to that extent. As a result, I kind of like using the aluminum rims on the wheel set on the Ripmo AF, and I like that fork down at 160. When I tried it with a 170, I did all kinds of silly stuff with the 170 on the AF. It felt okay, but it just made that flexy feel or whatnot. It amplified it. And not many other people ever complain about flex on the AF, so I think mine might be different than most other ones out there. And you know, the vast majority of people are not pushing their bikes quite as hard as we might be when we're shooting videos or whatnot, which is fine. I feel kind of weird saying that. I don't want to toot my own horn or whatever, but I also want to be honest and talk about what has been a challenge for me over the last few years. And it doesn't keep me off the AF. I still really like it. I distinctly notice it between these two. Neither of these bikes are all that plush at the top of the travel in comparison to some other bikes like the Evil is way plusher. And I actually prefer the way this suspension feels over the softer bikes. I pump into the bike a lot and I want that support to be there when I'm pushing into it. So I'm a fan of the way it feels in terms of not being super open at the top of the stroke. At this point, you can probably tell which bike I prefer. Hands down, I prefer the Carbon V2. It's 2 pounds lighter, it's noticeably stiffer, and then there's a bunch of smaller details that are way better. The internal tunnel cable routing, I don't need any zip ties to put together the Ripmo V2. For the AF, trying to route the cables inside the down tube and through the stays with no guides, it's doable, and we've all figured out tricks with dental picks and all that to make it easier than back in the day, but still, it takes a lot longer to build the AF than it does the Carbon one. So I am 5'8", and in terms of cockpit setup, I'm supported by P&W components, and they make really solid stuff. So I'm using a P&W bar cut down to 760 millimeters wide. I've tried a touch wider and a touch narrower on the Ripmo platform, and I always keep coming back to 760 as my personal sweet spot. With the stems, I can be equally happy with a 45 or a 50 millimeter length on these size medium bikes. And I've got 200 mil drop posts on both of the bikes. I've got the current loam dropper on the AF. On the Carbon V2, I've got an older P&W seat post, 200 mil drop, and it's still on there because it just totally works fine. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. When it comes to wheels, I am supported by Industry 9, and I've tried the aluminum and the carbon versions of their Enduro wheel sets on both bikes. Both bikes are set up with the Hydra hub and the aluminum Industry 9 system spokes. On the aluminum Ripmo AF, I kind of do prefer the aluminum Industry 9 wheels over the carbon ones, just because the bike feels a little more balanced. And I don't know if that's because I have that pre-production frame or what, but yeah, the aluminum wheels are pretty solid. The carbon ones are stiffer and nicer, and I think that's a part of why I like the Carbon V2 a little bit more, because it matches so nicely with that We Are One rim that Industry 9 uses on their 315C wheel set. I've ridden a ton with the carbon wheels on the AF, and it's not a problem or anything. This is like very subtle differences that you notice after 4 seasons. 19 on that bike, 20, 21, 22. If I can count right, that's 4. Now, if you're watching this video because you're looking for a good all-around mountain bike, I think the Ripmo platform is a wonderful choice for just about anybody. If you have really mellow, basic trails, you might want to go something a touch smaller. But if you have a bit of elevation where you live and ride the most, I think this platform is a great starting point for building a really good bike that you'll really enjoy. I've recommended it to many friends, and they've all been really happy with their Ripmos. If you guys found this video helpful, enjoyable, terrible, any of the above, please help me out. Leave me a note in the comments down below. Have you personally ridden a Ripmo yet? Do you agree or disagree with what I've said? And also, hit the subscribe button. I post videos like this about once every week or two. Thanks to all of you, and thanks to Ibis for getting me these bikes all those years ago, and huge shout out to Jensen for supporting this video. If you haven't yet, hit that link below to learn more about the AF and the Carbon over at Jensen USA, and there's that great sale running right now on the aluminum one that would be hard to not take advantage of. Okay, I think I need to go for a bike ride. Thanks everyone, peace.